Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling and unexplained cases ever documented in the American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. The morning of August 14, 1846, began like any other on the Hartwell plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. The air hung thick with humidity, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. But by noon, something would happen that would split the county into factions, ignite newspaper headlines across 3 states, and force an entire community to confront the darkest corner of their souls. A 7-year-old girl named Sarah would be sentenced to death for stealing a single green apple. This is not a story about justice. This is a story about how far humanity can fall when power meets prejudice and how one small act of hunger became a catalyst that exposed the brutal machinery of antebellum, Mississippi. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about this period in American history. The details are documented in county records, personal letters, and newspaper archives that have been sealed for decades. The Hartwell plantation occupied 2,400 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land. 300 enslaved people worked the property, living in 2 rows of wooden cabins that sat behind the main house like forgotten afterthoughts. The plantation owner, Edmund Hartwell, was a 3rd-generation planter whose family had built their fortune on cotton and cruelty in equal measure. Sarah belonged to no one and everyone. Her mother, Ruth, had died during childbirth 3 years earlier, leaving the child to be raised collectively by the women in the quarters. She was small for her age, with eyes that seemed too old for her face and hands that bore calluses from picking cotton since she could walk. The apple orchard sat on the eastern boundary of the property, a half-acre plot that Edmund's wife, Margaret, tended with obsessive care. 23 trees produced fruit that the Hartwells sold to merchants in Natchez for premium prices. The orchard was forbidden territory for the enslaved, marked by a wooden fence and the understood threat of punishment. On that August morning, Sarah had been working in the fields since dawn. The overseer, a man named Jacob Trent, drove the workers with a combination of shouted commands and the ever-present coiled whip at his belt. By 10 o'clock, the temperature had climbed past 90 degrees, and the water barrel sat empty, its contents depleted hours earlier. Sarah's stomach had been empty for longer. Rations on the Hartwell plantation were measured with precision. Cornmeal, salt, pork, and molasses distributed every Saturday. By Thursday, most families had exhausted their portions. The children ate last and least. At 10, Trent rode to the main house to deliver the morning cotton count. In those 15 minutes of unsupervised time, Sarah slipped away from her row and moved toward the orchard. She did not run. She walked with the careful deliberation of a child who had learned to make herself invisible. The fence posts cast thin shadows across the red dirt. Sarah squeezed between 2 boards, her small frame navigating the gap easily. The apple trees stood in neat rows, their branches heavy with fruit still weeks away from ripeness. She reached for the lowest apple she could find, a small green sphere no larger than her fist. The apple was bitter, its flesh hard and sour. Sarah bit into it anyway, her jaw working to break down the tough fruit. She had consumed perhaps a quarter of it when she heard the sound of hoof-beats approaching. Margaret Hartwell rode a gray mare named Constance. She made daily inspections of the orchard, counting trees and examining fruit with the intensity of a general surveying fortifications. When she rounded the corner and saw the small figure standing beneath her prized Grimes golden tree, she pulled the reins so sharply that Constance reared. Sarah froze. The partially eaten apple fell from her hand and landed in the dust at her feet. For a moment, woman and child stared at each other across a distance of perhaps 30 feet. Then Margaret's face transformed into something terrible. She began to scream. The sound carried across the fields. A high-pitched alarm that brought workers' heads up from their labor. Trent came galloping from the main house, his horse kicking up clouds of red dirt. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered at the orchard fence. Margaret dismounted and strode towards Sarah with such fury that several of the gathered enslaved people instinctively stepped back. She seized the child by the arm, her fingers digging into the thin flesh hard enough to leave bruises that would still be visible days later. "Thief!" Margaret hissed. "You ungrateful, thieving creature!" Sarah did not cry. She had learned early that tears meant nothing to people like the Hartwells. She stood still as Margaret dragged her toward the main house, her bare feet stumbling over the uneven ground. Edmund Hartwell was in his study when his wife burst through the door, pulling Sarah behind her like a caught animal. He looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from annoyance to interest as Margaret explained what had transpired. "She was in the orchard. Edmund eating our apples, stealing from us." Edmund stood slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow across the mahogany desk. He moved around it with measured steps and looked down at Sarah. The child met his gaze briefly, then dropped her eyes to the floor. "How old is this one?" Edmund asked. 7, Margaret replied. "Maybe 8, Ruth's child." Edmund nodded slowly. He walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the cotton fields where work had slowed as people watched the main house, waiting to see what punishment would be delivered. "Call Sheriff Patterson," Edmund said finally. "Tell him we're pressing charges for theft." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "You mean to involve the law?" "I mean to make an example," Edmund replied, turning from the window. The other plantations have been having problems with theft, food going missing, tools disappearing. This needs to be addressed publicly. What Edmund Hartwell could not have known in that moment was that his decision to involve civil authorities would set in motion a legal process that would spiral far beyond his control. Mississippi law in 1846 permitted enslaved people to be tried in court for capital crimes, a provision rarely invoked but still very much on the books. Sheriff Marcus Patterson arrived at the plantation 2 hours later. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had held his position for 12 years through a combination of political connections and willingness to look the other way when circumstances required. He listened to Margaret's account of the theft, examined the partially eaten apple that she had preserved as evidence, and then looked at Sarah with an expression that might have been pity. "You want me to take her to the county jail?" Patterson asked. "I want her prosecuted," Edmund said firmly. Under the full extent of the law, Patterson shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Mr. Hartwell, with respect, we're talking about a child and an apple. Maybe a whipping would suffice." "The law makes no distinction regarding age in matters of theft," Edmund replied. "And I will not have my property disrespected." The sheriff understood then that he was dealing with something more than simple theft. This was about power, about sending a message that would resonate across every plantation in Wilkinson County. He nodded slowly and reached for the rope at his belt. Sarah was led from the Hartwell plantation in chains. The Wilkinson County Jail occupied a brick building on Main Street in Woodville, the county seat. It consisted of 6 cells, a small office for the sheriff, and a larger room where trials were occasionally held when the courthouse was occupied. The building smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and something deeper that might have been despair. Sarah was placed in the smallest cell, barely 6 foot square, with a wooden bench and a bucket in the corner. The barred window sat too high for her to see through. She sat on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, exactly as she had been taught to sit when white people were present. News of the arrest spread through Woodville with remarkable speed. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside the jail, their voices rising in debate. Some argued that the arrest was proper enforcement of property rights. Others maintained that prosecuting a child for stealing food was an obscene misuse of the legal system. The town's newspaper, the Woodville Republican, sent a reporter named Thomas Brennan to interview Sheriff Patterson. Brennan was a transplant from Pennsylvania, only 2 years in Mississippi, still naive enough to believe that journalism could influence justice. "What are the charges exactly?" Brennan asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. "Theft of property valued at approximately 3 cents, Patterson replied. "Plus trespassing, and the defendant is 7 years old. Age is immaterial under Mississippi law," Patterson said, though his tone suggested he was reciting something he had been told rather than expressing personal conviction. Brennan's article appeared the next morning under the headline, "Child Slave Arrested for Apple Theft. Questions Raised About Proportional Justice." The piece was measured in tone, but clear in implication. It quoted extensively from Mississippi legal code while also noting that no child under the age of 10 had been prosecuted for theft in Wilkinson County in at least 20 years. The article had 2 immediate effects. First, it drew attention from newspapers in Natchez, Vicksburg, and even as far north as Memphis. Second, it hardened Edmund Hartwell's resolve. He viewed the article as an attack on his character and his rights as a property owner. Inside her cell, Sarah experienced time differently than the adults debating her fate outside. She had no concept of legal proceedings or public opinion. She knew only that she had done something wrong and that punishment was coming. The only question was what form that punishment would take. On the second day of her imprisonment, she received her first visitor. Reverend William Foster was the pastor of Woodville Baptist Church, a tall man with gentle eyes and a habit of speaking in a soft voice that made people lean in to hear him. He had baptized Sarah's mother, Ruth, years earlier and had argued unsuccessfully with Edmund Hartwell about providing better rations for the enslaved on his plantation. Foster brought bread and milk, which Sarah consumed so quickly she nearly choked. He sat on the bench beside her and asked if she understood what was happening. Sarah shook her head. "You took something that didn't belong to you," Foster explained gently. "And now the law has to decide what should happen because of that." "I was hungry," Sarah said. These were the first words she had spoken since being arrested. Foster closed his eyes briefly. "I know, child. I know." He stayed for nearly an hour, mostly in silence. Before leaving, he placed his hand on Sarah's head and prayed aloud, asking God for mercy and wisdom for those who would judge this case. Sarah did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. It frightened her more than anything else had so far. The legal machinery moved with surprising speed. Judge Cornelius Whitfield scheduled a preliminary hearing for August 18th, 4 days after Sarah's arrest. Whitfield was known as a strict constructionist who believed that law must be applied uniformly regardless of circumstances. He was also a plantation owner himself with financial and social ties to Edmund Hartwell. The wheels of justice were turning, but they were grinding toward an outcome that no one could have predicted. The question wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about whether the system itself could recognize the difference between justice and cruelty. Mississippi law in 1846 existed in a strange duality. Enslaved people were simultaneously property and persons under the law. As property, they could be bought, sold, and punished at their owner's discretion. But for certain crimes, particularly those involving theft or violence against white people, they could be prosecuted as individuals in criminal court. This dual status created legal ambiguities that judges typically resolved in favor of plantation owners. But it also opened the possibility, however slim, for enslaved people to receive something resembling due process. The question in Sarah's case would become whether that due process was genuine or merely performative. The preliminary hearing took place in the larger room of the jail building. Judge Whitfield sat behind a borrowed desk. Sheriff Patterson stood to one side. Edmund and Margaret Hartwell occupied chairs against the wall. Sarah sat on a wooden stool, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. There was no defense attorney. Mississippi law did not require legal representation for enslaved defendants, and none had been appointed. The hearing lasted 17 minutes. Margaret Hartwell testified that she had witnessed Sarah in the orchard with the apple. Sheriff Patterson testified that he had recovered the partially eaten fruit and that Sarah had not denied taking it. Judge Whitfield asked Sarah directly if she had entered the orchard and taken the apple. Sarah said yes. The defendant has confessed to the crime. Whitfield announced this matter will proceed to trial. Given the defendant's status and the nature of the offense, I am setting trial for August 25th. Bail is denied. As Whitfield spoke those words, something unprecedented happened. Thomas Brennan, who had been observing from the back of the room, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." Whitfield looked at him with undisguised irritation. "This is not a public forum, Mr. Brennan." "I understand, Your Honor, but the public has a right to know that a child is being held without any legal representation and that she is facing criminal prosecution for an act that in any other context would be considered the natural response to hunger." The room fell silent. Edmund Hartwell's face flushed red. Whitfield's jaw tightened. "You are out of order, Mr. Brennan. Remove yourself, or I will have the sheriff remove you." Brennan left, but his point had been made. By that evening, his account of the hearing had been telegraphed to newspapers across the South. The story was no longer confined to Wilkinson County. In her cell that night, Sarah lay on the wooden bench and stared at the ceiling. She could hear voices outside, raised in argument. Some were angry, others pleading. She understood none of it. She knew only that the world had become incomprehensible, that she had crossed some invisible line by eating an apple, and that everyone seemed to think this was important enough to shout about. What Sarah could not have known was that her case was becoming a flashpoint in a larger debate about the nature of slavery itself. Abolitionists in the North were beginning to use her story as evidence of the system's inherent brutality. Defenders of slavery argued that property rights must be protected and that exceptions could not be made regardless of age or circumstances. Both sides were using Sarah as a symbol. Neither side was particularly concerned with Sarah as a person. As the trial date approached, the town of Woodville began to take on the atmosphere of a carnival. People traveled from neighboring counties to observe the proceedings. Hotels filled beyond capacity. Street vendors sold food and newspapers. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone knew what the outcome should be. But no one, not even Judge Whitfield himself, had any idea just how far this case would go. August 25, 1846, dawned clear and hot. By 8 o'clock in the morning, more than 200 people had gathered outside the Wilkinson County Courthouse, a Greek Revival building with white columns that gleamed in the early sun. The courtroom itself could accommodate perhaps 75 people. Sheriff Patterson and his deputies struggled to maintain order as the crowd pressed toward the entrance. Inside, Judge Whitfield took his seat at exactly 9 o'clock. He surveyed the packed courtroom with an expression that revealed nothing. To his right sat a jury of 12 men, all white, all property owners, 10 of them slaveholders themselves. There had been no selection process. Whitfield had simply appointed them the previous week. Sarah entered through a side door accompanied by Patterson. She wore the same dress she had been arrested in, now dirty and torn at the hem. Someone had attempted to comb her hair, but it remained tangled. She took her seat at the defendant's table alone. Her legs still did not reach the floor. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney James Hicks, a portly man in his 40s who had built his reputation on zealous enforcement of property laws. He stood and addressed the jury with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before the trial began. "Gentlemen of the jury, this is a straightforward case. The defendant, a slave girl named Sarah, did willfully and deliberately trespass onto the property of Mr. and Mrs. Edmund Hartwell. She then proceeded to steal an apple from their orchard, an apple they had cultivated with their own resources and labor. When confronted, she did not deny the theft. She showed no remorse. She offers no excuse sufficient to justify her criminal behavior. Rise paused, letting his words settle over the jury like a heavy blanket. Now, I know some of you may feel sympathy for this child. That is natural, but we must set aside sentiment and focus on the law. If we allow theft to go unpunished, regardless of the age of the thief, we undermine the very foundations of property rights that our society depends upon. We send a message that rules do not matter, that discipline is optional, that chaos may reign. He gestured towards Sarah without looking at her. This defendant knew the orchard was forbidden. She had been told, as all slaves on the Hartwell plantation are told, that the orchard is off limits. Yet she made a conscious choice to violate that rule. She chose theft over obedience, and now she must face the consequences of that choice. Rise called his witnesses. Margaret Hartwell testified again, her account unchanged from the preliminary hearing. Edmund Hartwell took the stand and spoke about the importance of maintaining discipline and order. Jacob Trent, the overseer, testified that Sarah had been properly fed and had no legitimate reason to steal. No one challenged any of the testimony. There was no cross-examination because there was no defense attorney. Judge Whitfield asked Sarah a few perfunctory questions, establishing that she understood she had taken the apple and that the apple did not belong to her. Sarah answered in a voice so quiet that people in the back of the courtroom had to lean forward to hear. The prosecution rested at 11:30. Judge Whitfield called a 1-hour recess. The courtroom emptied, but Sarah remained in her seat, flanked by deputies. She had not been given breakfast. No one had thought to provide lunch. At 12:30, court resumed. Cricks stood to deliver his closing argument. Gentlemen, the facts are not in dispute. The defendant has admitted her guilt. The only question before you is what message you wish to send to every slave in this county, indeed in this state. Will you say that theft is acceptable if the thief is young? If the thief is hungry, where does that logic end? Today it is an apple. Tomorrow it might be something more valuable. We must draw a firm line. He paused for effect. I am asking you to return a verdict of guilty and to recommend the maximum penalty allowed under law, not because we are cruel, but because we are just, because the law must mean something or it means nothing. Cricks sat down. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversation. Judge Whitfield banged his gavel once sharply. Does the defendant wish to address the court? Sarah looked up at him, confused. No one had explained that she could speak. She shook her head slightly. Whitfield turned to the jury. Gentlemen, you have heard the evidence. You will now retire to consider your verdict. The jury filed out. They were gone for 11 minutes. When they returned, the foreman, a plantation owner named Robert Dunn, stood and cleared his throat. We find the defendant guilty of theft. A sound rippled through the courtroom, half gasp, half murmur. Whitfield raised his hand for silence. Does the jury have a sentencing recommendation? Don hesitated. For the first time since the trial began, uncertainty flickered across his face. He looked at his fellow jurors, then back at the judge. Your Honor, the jury recommends that sentencing be left to the court's discretion. This was unexpected. Whitfield's eyebrows rose fractionally. He had anticipated a clear recommendation, likely for a severe whipping and return to the plantation. Instead, the jury had effectively passed the decision to him. Very well. I will announce sentence in 3 days. Court is adjourned. What happened in the next 72 hours would expose the darkest machinery of antebellum justice and force everyone involved to confront questions they had spent their entire lives avoiding. The case that had begun with a stolen apple was about to become something far more terrible. In the 3 days between verdict and sentencing, Woodville descended into fierce debate. Reverend Foster organized a petition asking for mercy, collecting 47 signatures from townspeople. Several plantation owners, including 2 members of the jury, wrote private letters to Judge Whitfield urging leniency. But Edmund Hartwell wrote letters too. He corresponded with other prominent plantation owners, arguing that any show of mercy would be interpreted as weakness. He met privately with Judge Whitfield twice. No records exist of what was discussed in those meetings, but witnesses reported seeing Hartwell enter Whitfield's chambers through a side door, staying for more than an hour each time. Thomas Brennan continued publishing articles, each one more pointed than the last. His August 27th piece, titled The Trial of Childhood Itself, generated responses from newspapers as far north as Boston. Northern abolitionists seized on the story, using it as evidence of slavery's inherent evil. Southern editors fired back, defending the legal process and arguing that Northern critics had no understanding of Southern society. Sarah, meanwhile, remained in her cell, unaware that she had become the center of a regional controversy. She spent her days sitting on the bench, occasionally sleeping, rarely speaking. Reverend Foster visited daily, bringing food and attempting conversation. Sarah responded with single-word answers or silence. On the morning of August 28th, Sheriff Patterson came to her cell earlier than usual. He looked troubled, his face drawn with lack of sleep. "Time for court," he said quietly. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been for the trial. People stood pressed against the walls. Others waited outside, hoping to hear the sentence secondhand. Judge Whitfield entered at precisely 9 o'clock and took his seat without looking at the crowd. Sarah was brought in and positioned before the bench. Whitfield shuffled papers for a moment, then looked down at her. "Sarah, you have been found guilty of theft by a jury of your peers. It is now my duty to impose sentence." He paused, and in that pause the courtroom held its collective breath. The law of Mississippi is clear on matters of theft. While some latitude exists for judges to consider mitigating circumstances, the law also recognizes that property rights must be protected and that violations of those rights must be met with appropriate consequences. Another pause. Whitfield's voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the edge of the bench with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "I have considered the facts of this case at length. I have weighed the defendant's age against the seriousness of the offense. I have reviewed precedent and consulted with legal scholars, and I have concluded that the integrity of our legal system demands that the law be applied uniformly without exception for age or circumstance." Someone in the back of the courtroom gasped. Reverend Foster stood up, his face stricken. "Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that the defendant Sarah be hanged by the neck until dead, said execution to be carried out at dawn on September 5, 1846. For a moment, absolute silence filled the courtroom. Then chaos erupted. People shouted, some in approval, others in horror. Several women began to cry. Reverend Foster pushed toward the bench, his voice rising above the din. "Your Honor, for the love of God, she is 7 years old." Judge Whitfield brought his gavel down repeatedly, the sharp cracks cutting through the noise. "Order. I will have order in this court. Sheriff, clear the courtroom." Patterson and his deputies began forcing people toward the exits. The process took nearly 20 minutes, marked by shoving, cursing, and one brief scuffle that ended with a man being dragged out in handcuffs. Sarah remained standing before the bench throughout, not fully understanding what had just happened, but sensing from the reactions around her that something terrible had been decided. When the courtroom had finally been cleared, only Patterson, Sarah, and Judge Whitfield remained. The judge sat in his chair staring at his desk. He did not look at Sarah. He did not speak. After several long minutes, He gestured to Patterson, who led Sarah back to her cell. News of the sentence spread across Mississippi within hours and reached the national press within days. The reaction was immediate and divided along predictable lines. Southern newspapers largely defended the sentence as proper application of law. Northern papers condemned it as barbaric. Religious leaders across denominations struggled to reconcile the sentence with Christian teaching. But while the debate raged, the machinery of execution began to turn, and Sarah, sitting in her cell, began the final week of her life. The night after the sentencing, Reverend William Foster sat in his study, unable to sleep. He spent the dark hours drafting a letter to Governor Henry Foote describing Sarah's case in detail, emphasizing her age, noting the trivial value of what had been stolen, and arguing that executing a child would bring shame upon the entire state. At dawn, he sent the letter by express courier and began organizing a campaign to pressure Judge Whitfield into reconsidering the sentence. Foster was not alone. Dr. Samuel Collins publicly stated that executing a child violated every medical understanding of human development and moral responsibility. 3 jury members approached the judge privately, saying they had never imagined the death penalty would be imposed. Most surprisingly, Jacob Trent came to Foster's church on August 29th. The overseer stood in the doorway, hat in hands. "I've seen people whipped. I've done the whipping myself, but hanging a child, Reverend, that ain't right." "Then help me," Foster replied. "Speak to Judge Whitfield." Trent shook his head. "I can't go against Mr. Hartwell. He'd have me out and blacklisted, but I needed someone to know I don't agree with this." The opposition found an unlikely ally in Eleanor Beaumont, a plantation owner's widow from Natchez. She owned 200 slaves herself, but wrote an open letter published across Mississippi. Executing a child for stealing food would provide abolitionists with propaganda more powerful than anything they could invent. "We are engaged in a battle for hearts and minds," Beaumont wrote. "To execute a 7-year-old child is to hand our enemies a weapon we may never recover from." Her letter had significant impact among the plantation-owning class. Several influential men began reconsidering their positions. Judge Whitfield received dozens of letters urging mercy. Some threatened violence if the execution proceeded. He refused to meet with anyone, remaining in his chambers and emerging only for other court business. Legal challenges emerged. 2 Natchez attorneys filed a motion for a new trial, arguing Sarah had been denied adequate representation. Whitfield rejected it without a hearing. A second motion sought to stay pending Supreme Court review. Whitfield denied it after 2 days, stating the Supreme Court had no jurisdiction. The focus shifted to Governor Foote. Reverend Foster's letter was followed by dozens more. A Methodist conference delegation traveled to Jackson to meet with him personally. Foote was in a difficult position. He depended on plantation owner support but was aware of growing national attention. He asked for time to consider. That time was running out. As August gave way to September, carpenters in Woodville began constructing the gallows in the town square. The structure went up slowly, a raised platform with 13 steps and a crossbeam. The carpenter, Peter Walsh, worked with frequent pauses, staring at the structure. He had built gallows before, but this felt different. The gallows became a focal point for the town's divided sentiments. Some walked past quickly, averting their eyes. Others stopped to examine it. A few brought their children to see it as a teaching moment about consequences. Sarah could not see the gallows from her cell, but she heard the hammering. She asked Sheriff Patterson what the noise was. He did not answer. Foster continued daily visits, though he struggled to find words. He tried focusing on spiritual matters, talking about heaven and peace, but the words felt hollow. On September 2nd, 3 days before the scheduled execution, Governor Foote announced his decision. He would not intervene. He expressed sympathy, but maintained he could not override a judge's sentence without clear legal error. The law had been followed, and the executive branch had no grounds to interfere. It was political cowardice dressed in constitutional language. That evening, Edmund Hartwell visited Judge Whitfield at his home. They met on the porch. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices and seeing Hartwell gesture emphatically before storming to his carriage. Some speculated Hartwell was having second thoughts. Others believed he was ensuring the sentence would be carried out. Sarah had stopped eating. She accepted water but refused food. Dr. Collins examined her on September 3rd and found her feverish and unresponsive. He diagnosed extreme malnutrition and emotional shock. The child might not survive until the execution date, he told Patterson. Then we'd best move quickly, Patterson replied quietly. Collins stared in disbelief. You cannot be serious. I have my orders. The execution is scheduled for September 5th. The night of September 4th, Foster received permission to stay in Sarah's cell. He brought blankets, water, and a Bible. Sarah was conscious, but spoke little. Will it hurt? She asked. Foster felt tears burning. I don't know, child. I pray it will be quick. They sat in silence for hours. Outside, Woodville settled into uneasy sleep. The gallows stood empty, waiting, and the machinery of execution prepared for its final terrible work. September 5, 1846. The sky lightened at 5:43, pale gray, shifting to pink. Sheriff Patterson had not slept. He had spent the night reviewing execution protocol repeatedly, as if meticulous attention to procedure could absolve him. The protocol was brief. Bring the condemned from the cell at first light. Escort to the gallows. Place the hood. Position the noose. Read the sentence aloud. Pull the lever. For a child weighing perhaps 50 pounds, death would come slowly. The drop would not generate force to sever the spinal cord. Sarah would suffocate, her body twisting until consciousness faded and her heart stopped. Patterson knew this. Dr. Collins had explained it in clinical detail. But Patterson was a man who followed orders. At 6 o'clock, he walked to Sarah's cell. Foster was still there, slumped against the wall. Sarah lay on the bench, curled into herself. It's time, Patterson said. Foster stood slowly. May God forgive us all. Patterson unlocked the cell. He had brought leg irons but set them aside. He simply gestured for Sarah to stand. The walk to the town square covered 200 yards. Perhaps 150 people had gathered despite the early hour. The crowd parted as Patterson, Sarah, and Foster approached. Some averted their eyes. A few women wept. Most stood in stunned silence. The gallows stood in the center, its fresh lumber pale yellow in early light. 13 steps led to the platform. Patterson climbed first, then helped Sarah. She negotiated the steps carefully, placing both feet on each one. On the platform, the executioner waited. Daniel Cross had performed 4 previous executions, all adult men convicted of murder. When contacted about this case, he had initially refused. Only after being offered triple his fee had he agreed. Cross avoided looking at Sarah. He had positioned the noose carefully, testing it multiple times. His face was ashen, jaw clenched tight. Patterson produced a folded paper and began reading. By order of Judge Cornelius Whitfield, the defendant Sarah, having been found guilty of theft and sentenced to death, is to be executed by hanging on this day, September 5, 1846. May God have mercy on her soul. He looked at Cross, who stepped forward with the hood. It was rough canvas, far too large. When Cross placed it over her, it hung past her shoulders. The noose came next. Cross lifted it over the hood and positioned it carefully, hands trembling as he tightened the knot. Foster stood at the base, lips moving in silent prayer. He clutched his Bible so tightly his knuckles had turned white. In the crowd, people began shouting for the execution to be stopped. 2 women fell to their knees. A young boy began crying. Patterson looked at Cross and nodded. Cross moved to the lever controlling the trapdoor. He placed his hand on it but did not pull. "Sir," Cross said quietly, "I can't do this." "You must. It's the law. She's a child. The sentence has been pronounced. We have no choice." Cross's hand remained on the lever but did not pull. Seconds stretched into a minute, then longer. Patterson stepped forward. "Step aside, Mr. Cross." Cross moved away. Patterson took his place at the lever. He looked once more at the small hooded figure standing on the trapdoor. Then hoofbeats echoed across the square. A rider approached at full gallop, pulling to a stop at the crowd's edge. He dismounted and pushed through, waving a sealed envelope. "Stop. In the name of the governor, stopped the execution." The man was Arthur Blake, a courier from Jackson. He climbed the gallows steps, breathing hard. "A stay of execution has been granted by Governor Foote. The governor orders that the prisoner be returned to custody pending further review." He handed the envelope to Patterson, who read it with trembling fingers. It was genuine, bearing the governor's seal and signature. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others protested. Foster collapsed to his knees. Patterson removed the noose from Sarah's neck and lifted off the hood. She blinked in the sudden light, confused. She had expected death and instead found herself still alive. What none of them knew was that this reprieve was not mercy. It was political calculation. Foote had received word that northern newspapers were planning editorials condemning Mississippi's child execution. The political cost had become too high. The reprieve was temporary, designed to buy time. The execution had been delayed, not cancelled. The sentence still stood. Sarah had been given more time to live, but the machinery of her death had only been paused. Sarah was returned to her cell in profound shock, unable to speak for 3 days. Reverend Foster stayed with her constantly, but his presence made no difference. She sat staring at nothing, her mind unable to process what had happened. The stay created immediate political turmoil. Governor Foote's statement said he had acted to ensure proper legal review, but his real motivations were transparent. Supporters accused him of caving to northern pressure. Opponents praised him while demanding he commute the sentence entirely. Judge Whitfield maintained the sentence was legally sound and should be carried out once the review concluded. Edmund Hartwell remained silent, but Margaret wrote to the Woodville Republican expressing disappointment that the execution had been stopped. National press coverage intensified. Northern papers ran editorials titled Mississippi's Shame. Southern papers defended property rights and accused Northern critics of hypocrisy. Sarah slowly began recovering her capacity for speech. On September 9th, she asked Foster, "Am I going to die?" Foster did not know how to answer. The 30-day stay was temporary. "I'm working to prevent that," he said. Foster allied with 2 Natchez attorneys, Morrison and Dunlap, who filed a writ of habeas corpus in federal court on September 12, arguing Mississippi's laws violated constitutional principles. Federal District Judge Marcus Anderson scheduled a hearing for September 20th. The legal question was complex. The Constitution protected property rights supporting state authority to prosecute theft, but it also contained due process provisions requiring adequate legal representation. Sarah being simultaneously property and person created a constitutional paradox never fully resolved. Morrison and Dunlap worked 18-hour days preparing arguments. District Attorney Hendricks filed a motion to dismiss, arguing federal courts had no jurisdiction over state criminal matters. The hearing took 6 hours. Morrison spoke passionately about fundamental fairness and constitutional principles, emphasizing Sarah's age and the trivial theft value. Hendricks countered with strict legal reasoning about state sovereignty and proper procedure. Judge Anderson took the case under advisement, ruling on September 27. His 23-page decision acknowledged the moral weight, but concluded federal courts lacked jurisdiction to overturn a state court's criminal sentence. Constitutional questions raised were insufficient to override state sovereignty principles. Morrison and Dunlap immediately filed an appeal, but the process would take months. Sarah did not have months. Governor Foote issued another statement. He was monitoring the situation and would make a final decision by October 15. Another delaying tactic, but public attention was not diminishing, it was intensifying. William Lloyd Garrison in Boston demanded Sarah be freed and slavery abolished. John C. Calhoun in Charleston argued Northern interference would lead inevitably to war. The nation was polarizing around a 7-year-old girl who had stolen an apple. Sarah's condition continued deteriorating. She ate little, slept poorly, spoke only when questioned. Dr. Collins reported she suffered from melancholia. Foster struggled to provide spiritual comfort, but found his own faith tested. Late one night, he wrote in his journal, "I fear we have built a society that calls evil good and good evil, that values property more than persons. If this is Christianity, we have perverted the gospel beyond recognition." As October approached, everyone waited for Foote's decision. The review period was expiring. Legal appeals had failed. He had no more excuses for delay. On October 14th, Foote sat in his Jackson office reviewing the file. Letters covered his desk in 2 piles. One urging mercy, one demanding the sentence be carried out. The piles were roughly equal. There was no good option. Every choice led to criticism. The statement was released October 15th at noon. Foote acknowledged unprecedented public interest. He recognized differing views. He reviewed proceedings and concluded no legal errors had occurred. The trial had been proper. The verdict supported. The sentence within judicial authority. However, he had decided to exercise executive clemency by commuting the death sentence. Sarah would not be executed. Instead, she would be sold at public auction with proceeds going to Edmund Hartwell. Sarah would be transported out of Mississippi and sold to a buyer in another state with a condition she never return. The reaction was swift and fierce. Abolitionists condemned it as treating a child as merchandise. Pro-slavery advocates were equally angry, arguing Foote had weakened property rights. Several Mississippi newspapers called for his resignation. Foster's journal entry: "The governor has found a way to avoid bloodshed while still destroying an innocent life. This is not mercy. This is moral cowardice given legal form." The auction was scheduled for October 22nd in Woodville's town square at the base of the gallows meant for Sarah's execution. Word of the auction spread quickly. Slave traders from Louisiana, Alabama, and Arkansas made plans to attend. Some saw opportunity for favorable purchase. Others came to witness the spectacle. Sarah was informed by Sheriff Patterson on October 16th. He tried explaining it in terms she might understand, but the concept of being sold was as foreign as execution had been. She knew only that she would be taken away from Woodville from people she knew from her mother's grave. "Will I see my mama's grave again?" she asked Foster. Foster had no answer that wouldn't break both their hearts. He simply embraced her while tears fell silently. In the days before the auction, Sarah's demeanor changed. The withdrawn silence gave way to watchful weariness. She seemed to be preparing for another incomprehensible trauma. On October 20th, Eleanor Beaumont visited Foster's church. She had been following Sarah's case and decided to attend the auction with the intention of purchasing Sarah herself. "I can give her a decent life," Beaumont told Foster. "My plantation is large, but I run it differently. The people there are well-fed, properly clothed, not subjected to excessive punishment. Sarah would work, but she would be safe. Foster studied her carefully. "You're asking me to endorse this? I'm telling you that given the circumstances, it may be the best outcome possible. If Sarah is sold to a trader, she could end up anywhere. Deep South cotton plantations where life expectancy is measured in years. Louisiana sugar fields where the work kills people. At least with me you would know where she is." Foster sat silent. "Slavery is evil, Mrs. Beaumont. Even kind slavery is still evil." "Then don't tell her it's acceptable. Tell her it's survivable because that's the truth we're dealing with. Sarah will be sold. The question is to whom?" Foster had no response. October 22nd arrived gray and threatening rain. By 9 o'clock, several hundred people had gathered. Some were potential buyers. Others were curious onlookers. A few protesters held signs reading, "Thou shalt not steal children." Patterson brought Sarah from the jail at 9:30. She wore the dress she had worn to the gallows, cleaned and mended. Her face was expressionless. The auctioneer, Gerald Hampton from Natchez, positioned Sarah on a raised platform near the gallows. He began his patter describing her as a healthy young female, approximately 7 years of age, suitable for household work or field labor training. He mentioned her notoriety as if it were a selling point. Bidding started at $50. A trader from Alabama raised it to $75. Another went to $100. The price climbed steadily. Eleanor Beaumont stood near the back waiting. When bidding reached $150, she raised her hand. $200. The crowd murmured. That was well above market value. Several bidders dropped out. One Louisiana trader countered with $225. Beaumont went to $250. The Louisiana trader hesitated, then withdrew. No one else bid. Hampton called once, twice, 3 times. The gavel came down. Sold to Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont of Natchez for $250. Sarah had been purchased. Her life valued at $250, approximately the cost of a decent horse. Beaumont paid in cash. Edmund Hartwell accepted the money with evident satisfaction. Paperwork was completed in Patterson's office. Beaumont signed documents transferring ownership. The process took less than 10 minutes. When complete, Beaumont turned to Sarah. "You'll be coming with me to Natchez. We'll leave this afternoon." Sarah shook her head. She owned nothing except the dress she wore. Foster was allowed 15 minutes to say goodbye. He knelt to Sarah's level and took her hands. "Mrs. Beaumont is a good woman. She'll treat you fairly. Do your work. Follow instructions and you'll be safe." "Will I ever come back here?" Foster's throat tightened. "No, child. The governor's order says you can never return to Mississippi. Will I see my mama's grave again?" Foster pulled Sarah into an embrace, tears falling into her hair. When 15 minutes expired, Beaumont gently separated them. It's time. The journey to Natchez covered 35 miles by covered coach. Sarah sat across from Beaumont, watching Wilkinson County disappear. They passed cotton fields where people worked in long rows. They crossed wooden bridges over low-running creeks. They stopped once to water horses at a roadside inn. Beaumont said little, giving Sarah space to process what had happened. They arrived at Riverside Plantation. As the sun set, the property sat on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River with a white-painted main house and columns mimicking Greek architecture. Behind stretched fields, outholdings, and 2 rows of slave quarters housing 200 workers. Beaumont led Sarah to the quarters and introduced her to Martha, an older woman serving as informal community leader. Martha was perhaps 50 with gray stray hair and a face marked by decades of labor but not broken. "This is Sarah. She'll be staying in your cabin. I'm trusting you to help her adjust." Martha looked at Sarah with sympathy and weariness. Everyone had heard about the girl nearly hanged for stealing an apple. "Just move. I'll look after her." Martha led Sarah into a small cabin housing 3 others. Martha, a young woman named Clara, and Clara's infant son. The space was cramped but clean with packed dirt floor and a small fireplace. "You hungry?" Sarah nodded. Martha produced cornbread and beans. Sarah ate slowly, aware the others were watching. "Is it true you almost got hanged?" Claire asked. "Leave her be," Martha said sharply. "Child's been through enough." That night, Sarah lay on a corn husk pallet, staring at the ceiling. She heard Clara's baby breathing, Martha snoring, and outside the plantation settling into darkness. She thought about Woodville, about Foster, about the gallows. She thought about her mother, Ruth, whose face she barely remembered. She wondered if Ruth would be ashamed or proud. Sleep came eventually, restless and broken by dreams of falling. Martha woke her before dawn. Work began at sunrise. Sarah's assignment was weeding and collecting debris from harvested rows. The work was hard but not impossible. The overseer, Thomas Reed, used his voice more than his whip, but the threat remained. Sarah worked through that first day in numb detachment. Her hands moved automatically. Her mind existed elsewhere. Over following weeks, Sarah adapted. She learned plantation rhythms, when to work, rest, speak, stay silent. She learned which people to trust and which to avoid. She learned to make herself useful but not visible. Eleanor Beaumont rarely spoke to Sarah after that first day. She ran her plantation through overseers and trusted intermediaries. But Sarah sensed Beaumont was watching, assessing her investment. Other enslaved people gradually accepted Sarah's presence. The notoriety faded as daily life reasserted its demands. She became just another child in the quarters, another worker in the fields. But something in Sarah had changed permanently. The child who had reached for an apple was gone. In her place was someone harder, more guarded, someone who understood the world's casual cruelty. Martha noticed. One evening by the fireplace, she spoke quietly. "You got that look? I've seen it in people who've been broken. But you ain't broke yet, child. You're still here. Still breathing. That counts for something." Sarah didn't respond. She wasn't sure Martha was right. Being alive and being unbroken were not the same thing. As autumn gave way to winter, news arrived from Wilkinson County. The gallows had been dismantled. Judge Whitfield had retired, citing health reasons. Edmund Hartwell's plantation had experienced mysterious fires. Foster continued his ministry but never spoke publicly about the case again. The story of Sarah became a footnote in slavery's larger narrative. Abolitionists cited it in speeches. Historians would later reference it as an example of legal contradictions. But for Sarah, it was simply her life, the thing she had to live with every morning. Years would pass. Sarah would grow into a young woman on Riverside Plantation. She would experience more loss, more hardship, more grinding daily reality. But she would also experience unexpected kindness, friendships in shared suffering, and the stubborn human capacity to find meaning in meaningless circumstances. The apple was long forgotten, rotted into Mississippi soil. But its consequences rippled outward, touching more lives than anyone in Woodville could have imagined. That August morning in 1846, what happened after 1846 reveals something profound about how history remembers injustice and how individuals survive it. Sarah's story doesn't end with her sale. It transforms into something both heartbreaking and quietly remarkable. Sarah lived at Riverside for 15 years. She grew from traumatized child into a young woman who learned to navigate enslavement's impossible reality while carrying her infamous past. Martha remained her protector and teacher, imparting survival skills in quiet moments. When the Civil War began in 1861, Riverside felt immediate effects. Confederate recruitment drained white men from the region. Overseers became scarce. plantation structure began cracking. Eleanor Beaumont, facing management challenges, made a shocking decision. She began paying modest wages to workers who remained and loosened movement restrictions. It wasn't freedom, but it was different. Sarah, now 22, used this opportunity to learn reading and writing, taught secretly by a tutor Beaumont had hired for her own children. Sarah proved exceptional, absorbing information with focused intensity. She understood knowledge was power, perhaps the only power available to her. When Union forces occupied Natchez in 1863, everything changed. The Emancipation Proclamation technically freed enslaved people in Confederate territories, though enforcement was uneven. Sarah found herself in legal limbo. Technically free, but with nowhere to go and no resources. Beaumont offered a choice: leave or stay and work for wages. Sarah chose to stay temporarily, recognizing she had few options. She worked for wages for 2 years, saving every penny. In 1865, with the war ending and slavery officially abolished, Sarah left Riverside as a free woman at 26. She traveled to Vicksburg, where freedmen's aid organizations had established themselves. She found work as a lairess, hard labor, but work that was hers to refuse. In Vicksburg, Sarah encountered Thomas Brennan, the reporter who had covered her case 20 years earlier. He was working for the Freedmen's Bureau. When he realized who she was, he was stunned. "I thought you were dead." "I survived," Sarah replied simply. Brennan asked if she would tell her story for historical record. Sarah agreed. Over several weeks, she dictated her experiences. The resulting document, now held in the National Archives, is one of the most detailed first-person accounts. "They tried to kill me for an apple," Sarah said in one passage. "But I'm still here. That has to count for something." Sarah married in 1867. Her husband, James Richardson, was a former slave from Louisiana who had enlisted in the Union Army and received a small pension. Together, they moved to a freedmen's settlement near Jackson, where they purchased 5 acres and built a small farm. The irony of returning to Mississippi, the state that had tried to execute her, was not lost on Sarah. But the governor's order had been issued under Confederate authority and was void after the war. Sarah and James had 4 children. She raised them with fierce protective instincts and determination. They would have opportunities she had been denied. All 4 learned to read and write. 2 attended Freedmen's Bureau schools. Sarah rarely spoke about her past with her children. When they asked about her childhood, she gave vague answers. The story of the apple, the trial, the gallows, she kept that locked away. The farms struggled financially. Reconstruction-era Mississippi was hostile to black land ownership, but they held on through hard work and stubborn refusal to be displaced again. In the 1880 census, Sarah gave her age as 41. Her occupation was listed as farmer. Her literacy, property value, $350. These bureaucratic facts represented a life rebuilt from complete devastation. Sarah lived until 1892, dying at 53 from pneumonia. She was buried in a freedmen's cemetery near Jackson, her grave marked with a simple wooden cross that has long since weathered away. Her children survived her. Her grandchildren spread across Mississippi and beyond, most never knowing the full story. The connection to the famous case was lost as generations passed. The legal precedents from Sarah's case contributed to later debates about due process and equal protection. Legal scholars would cite it as an example of how slavery corrupted the entire legal system. But perhaps the most important legacy is simplest. Sarah survived. Against every expectation, every injustice, every attempt to destroy her, she survived and built a life that mattered. She raised children who raised children who raised children. She existed. She persisted. The apple that nearly cost her life was worth perhaps 3 cents. The life she built afterward was beyond price. Sarah's story asks uncomfortable questions America still struggles to answer. What does justice mean when the law itself is unjust? How does society reckon with legal atrocities committed in the name of order? Sarah never demanded answers. She simply lived her life as fully as circumstances permitted, raising her family, teaching her children, tending her garden, surviving. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest resistance available to take a life powerful people tried to end and transform it into something that mattered, something that endured, something that refused to be forgotten. Sarah's great-great-grandchildren live today, most unaware of this history. But the history exists nonetheless, woven into American memory, a reminder of how far the nation has come and how much further it needs to go. This is Sarah's story. Not just what was done to her, but what she became despite it all. A story about injustice and survival, about systems and individuals, about the price of an apple and the immeasurable worth of a human.